I've been carrying this story around for almost 6 years now, and I've told it exactly twice, once to my wife, who asked me to never tell her again, and once to a Forest Service ranger who looked at me like I'd just confessed to something. I'm telling it now because I read last week that another hiker went missing in the same drainage, and I can't sleep anymore knowing what I know and not saying it out loud. I was 31 years old, 4 days into a solo section hike of the Art Loeb Trail in Pisgah National Forest. I'd done plenty of solo trips before. I grew up in western North Carolina, and the mountains felt like family to me, not friendly exactly, but known. The kind of place where you understood the rules, even if nobody had ever said them out loud. Don't whistle after dark. Don't answer if someone calls your name from the trees, and you don't recognize the voice. Don't take shortcuts off the marked trail, no matter how good the daylight looks. My grandmother used to say the mountains keep what they're given, and she meant it the way other grandmothers say grace. The third afternoon, the weather turned. My little weather radio had promised scattered showers through the evening, but what came over the ridge was something else. A wall of black cloud moving fast enough that I could watch the trees on the far slope disappear into it. The temperature dropped maybe 15 degrees in 10 minutes. I knew I wasn't making it to my planned campsite. I started looking for any flat patch of ground where I could throw up my tent and ride it out, but the trail was running along a steep cut, all rocks and roots, nowhere to pitch. That's when I saw the roof. It was tucked maybe 100 yards off trail, down a slight draw, in a little hollow between two ridges. Black tin, rusted at the seams, with a stone chimney leaning slightly to one side. The cabin underneath it was low and squat, the kind built by hand in the early 1900s, chestnut logs, square-notched, the chinking gone gray with age. I'd hiked all over this part of the forest for 15 years, and I had never seen it. But I wasn't really thinking about that. I was thinking about staying dry. The rain had started, fat cold drops that meant the real downpour was minutes behind, and I bushwhacked down through the rhododendron toward the porch. The door was already open, not wide, just cracked, maybe a foot, the way you leave a door when you're going to come right back. I called out from the porch, "Hello, hello, anybody home?" My voice swallowed by the rising wind. Nothing answered. I stepped inside. The smell is what I remember first. Wet ash from the fireplace, which would have been normal in any old cabin, but underneath it was something sweeter, almost fermented, like a bowl of fruit somebody had set out and forgotten about a week ago. I told myself it was probably canned peaches gone bad in the pantry. I told myself a lot of things in the next 10 minutes that I knew weren't true, even while I was thinking them. The cabin had 2 rooms. The front was a kitchen and sitting area, with a hand-hewn table in the middle and 2 ladder-back chairs pulled up to it. On the table were 2 tin plates with food on them, beans and what looked like cornbread. The cornbread wasn't stale, I could see steam wasn't coming off it, but it had that soft look that bread only has for the first hour or so after it comes out of the pan. There was a kerosene lamp on the table too. I touched the glass without thinking about why I was touching it, and the glass was warm, not hot, warm. The way a lamp's glass is when it's been burning and somebody just blew it out. Somebody had been sitting at this table within the last hour, maybe within the last 20 minutes. I should have left right then. I want to say I almost did, but the rain was coming down hard now, drumming on the tin roof so loud I could barely hear myself think. And there was a part of me, the part of me I don't fully trust anymore, that was curious. I told myself maybe whoever lived here had stepped out to the outhouse, or to bring in firewood, and I'd just startled them, and they'd come back any minute, and we'd laugh about it. That's when I noticed the coloring book. It was on the floor next to the smaller chair, open to a page about halfway through. A child's drawing, done in red and brown crayon. It was a house, but the proportions were all wrong. The house was tall and narrow, with way too many windows. I counted them later. I keep counting them in my head. 23 windows on what was supposed to be a 2-story house, and in every window was a face. Just dots for eyes, no mouths. The faces weren't all the same size. Some were big, taking up the whole window. Some were small, peeking from the corner. The child had pressed so hard with the brown crayon that the paper had torn in places. There was no child's voice in the cabin, no movement, nothing but the rain. I called out again. "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice cracked. The kerosene lamp's wick was still curled, still warm. I walked toward the back room. The door to it was open too, hanging on leather hinges that had been replaced more recently than the rest of the cabin. The boards under my feet didn't creak the way old boards should. Somebody had taken care of this place. Somebody had kept it up. When I stepped into the back room, I stopped breathing for a second. The walls were covered in tally marks. Every wall, every inch from the floor to the ceiling, carved into the chestnut logs. Clusters of 4 vertical lines and a slash across, repeated and repeated and repeated. The oldest carvings were so worn down they were just shadows in the wood, the edges rounded smooth by time. The newest ones were sharp and pale, the wood inside them still cream-colored, freshly cut. There were thousands. I'm not exaggerating. I tried later to estimate, and I came up with somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 marks, if you assume the deeper layers of the wall were carved over older ones I couldn't see anymore. In the center of the back wall, above what had been a small fireplace, someone had written in charcoal across the stones. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, like it had been done in a hurry or in the dark. He counts us when we sleep. I read it 3 times. I think I read it 3 times. My mind kept sliding off the words, refusing to take them in. He counts us when we sleep. Not I, not they, us. Whoever wrote that was including themselves in whatever was being counted. I heard a sound from the front room. Just a single sound, a wooden chair scraping a 1/4 inch across the floor. I have never moved as fast in my life as I moved out of that cabin. I left my pack on the floor of the back room. I left my rain shell on the chair where I'd hung it. I went out the front door with the rain hitting me like a wall of needles, and I ran. Full sprint, up the draw and back to the trail. And I didn't stop running until I'd put 2 ridges between me and that hollow. The whole time, I had the absolute certainty that something was watching me from the porch. Not chasing, just watching. I made it back to the trailhead by full dark. I was hypothermic, scraped up, missing 1 bootlace. The drive home, I kept the radio on loud the whole way and kept checking my rearview mirror without knowing what I was checking for. The next morning I called the ranger station and reported what I'd found. I didn't tell them about the writing or the tally marks at first. I just said there was an occupied cabin that didn't seem to be on any maps, and I wanted to make sure the people inside were okay because of the storm and the abandoned dinner. The ranger I talked to, an older guy named Halloran, asked me to describe the location 3 different times. Then he was quiet for a long time on the phone. He said, "Can you come down to the station?" When I got there, he had a topographical map spread out on his desk, and he asked me to point to where I'd been. I traced the trail and pointed to the hollow. He looked at the map and then up at me, and the color went out of his face. He told me there hadn't been a registered cabin in that drainage since 1953. He said a family had lived there, a man, a woman, and 4 children, and they'd all gone missing one winter. The cabin had been searched, abandoned, eventually condemned, and finally collapsed sometime in the late 60s. He said the foundation was still there, but everything else was long gone. I told him no. I'd been inside it less than 24 hours ago. There was food on the table. There was a lamp still warm. There was a child's coloring book on the floor. He didn't argue with me. That was the worst part. He just nodded slowly and said, "Let's go look." We drove as far as we could and then hiked in. It was a clear morning, the kind that comes after a storm in the Blue Ridge. The air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. I led him down the draw to the hollow. There was no cabin. There was a foundation, 4 stone walls, knee-high, mostly buried under leaf litter and moss. The corners caved in, a fallen chimney, the stones scattered, a rusted piece of tin roof, maybe 3 feet across, half swallowed by the dirt, trees growing up through where rooms had been. The kind of ruin that takes 50, 60 years to become. My pack was on what had been the porch. Sitting upright on the stone, perfectly dry, the rain shell folded neatly on top of it. Halloran stood very still. I walked over to my pack on legs that didn't feel like mine. I picked it up. Everything was inside, exactly as I'd left it. My wallet, my phone, the freeze-dried meals. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed. That's when Halloran said, "Soft, come look at this." He was standing by the foundation. On the top of one of the stones, near where the front door would have been, someone had carved a single tally mark. 1 vertical line, freshly cut, the wood pale stone bright against the weathered gray around it. The shavings were still in the moss next to it. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. He didn't say anything else. We hiked out. He filed a report and I filed a report, and nothing ever came of either of them. The foundation isn't on any current map either. Halloran retired the next spring. I tried to call him a couple of years ago, just to ask if he ever thought about it, and his daughter answered and told me he'd passed. I've never gone back to Pisgah. I won't. But I read the local hiking news, and I read the missing persons reports for that part of the state, and I've started to notice something. Every few years, somebody disappears in that drainage. Not often. Not enough to make the news outside the county, but often enough. And I keep thinking about the writing above the fireplace. He counts us when we sleep. And I keep thinking about that fresh tally mark on the stone, cut sometime between when I ran out of that cabin and when I came back the next day with the ranger. I keep wondering whether it was for me, whether I got counted, whether something out there in that hollow has my number now, the way it had the numbers of the family in 1953 and the hikers since, and whether one night, when I'm asleep in my own bed 300 miles away, it'll come and finish whatever it started in the rain. I lock my doors, I leave a light on, it doesn't help. Some nights I wake up at exactly the same hour, and I lie there in the dark, and I count my own breaths, and I wonder if something else is counting them too. My grandfather died in February of a year I'd rather not name, and my father called me the night of the funeral and asked if I'd help him clear out the old cabin. I said yes, the way you say yes to family things, automatic. Before you've really thought it through. The cabin was up off a Forest Service road in Watauga County, North Carolina, deep in the kind of country where the cell towers give up before the pavement does. I'd been there maybe 4 times in my life, once as a child, twice as a teenager, and once when I was 22 and my grandfather had a fall and needed help getting back on his feet. He'd lived alone up there since my grandmother passed in the 80s. He hunted. He grew most of what he ate. He didn't have a phone. We checked on him by mail and by the occasional visit, and he wrote my father a letter every Christmas in handwriting that got smaller and shakier every year. The drive up took most of a Saturday. My father didn't talk much on the way, which wasn't unusual for him, but there was a quality to the quiet I hadn't heard before. He kept gripping the steering wheel and then loosening his hands like he was reminding himself to relax. About a mile from the turnoff, on a stretch of road where the trees pressed in close on both sides, he said, without looking at me, "Don't go in the root cellar." I asked him what. He said, "Your grandpa made me promise." He said, "When I helped him bury your grandmother, he made me promise that nobody in our family would ever go in that root cellar again. And I'm passing the promise to you now. Just stay out of it. Don't even open the door." I'm 34 years old. I have a graduate degree. I work in insurance claims for a regional carrier, and I spend my days reading reports of car accidents and storm damage and explaining to people why the math is the math. I love my father, and I respected my grandfather, even though I didn't really know him, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't roll my eyes a little. Mountain people pass down a lot of rules without remembering where they came from. Don't whistle in the woods. Don't sweep dust out the front door after dark. Don't speak ill of the spring house. I figured the root cellar promise was something like that, some old superstition my grandfather had inherited from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, who'd built the cabin in the 1880s, and probably had his reasons that died with him. I said, "Okay, Dad, I won't go in the cellar." I meant it when I said it. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft above, a wood stove for heat, a hand pump in the kitchen. Everything inside it was made by hand, or had been there for 100 years. My grandfather's clothes were still on the pegs by the door. His coffee cup was upside down on the drying rack. The whole place smelled like him, pipe tobacco and wood smoke, and the particular dry smell of old paper. We started cataloging what to keep, what to donate, what to burn. It was slow, sad work. My father kept finding things he hadn't seen since he was a boy, and going quiet for a long time before setting them in one pile or another. The root cellar door was in the kitchen floor, just past the wood stove. It was a heavy plank door with iron strap hinges, set flush into the boards, with a thick wooden bar laid across 2 iron brackets to hold it shut. The bar had been worn smooth on top, the way wood gets when somebody's hands have rested on it 1,000 times. There was a horseshoe nailed to the door, not above it, the way you'd hang one for luck. On it, open and down, which is the way mountain people hang horseshoes when they don't want luck so much as they want to keep something from passing through. I noticed all of this, and I said nothing about it, and my father moved past the door without ever once looking at it, which was its own kind of saying. We worked until dark, made a simple supper from the canned goods in the pantry. My father slept on the daybed in the front room and I took the loft. The cabin had a generator, but we didn't run it, just used kerosene lamps and the firelight. I lay in the loft listening to the wind move through the chestnut oaks outside and the small house noises of an old building settling, and I drifted off easier than I expected to. The first knock came around 2 in the morning. I was awake instantly. Not gradually, the way you usually wake up, but all at once, my eyes open, my body completely still. I knew immediately that the sound had come from inside the cabin, from below me, from under the floor. 3 taps. Then a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then 3 more taps. Patient, even. The kind of knock you'd give on a door if you didn't want to startle whoever was on the other side. The kind of knock you'd give if you knew they could hear you and you were just letting them know you were there. I lay in the loft and didn't move. I told myself it was the cabin settling. I told myself it was an animal under the floor. I told myself a lot of things in the dark. The taps came again. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. They were coming from directly under the kitchen, from where the root cellar door was. I could picture the door in my mind, the horseshoe, the wooden bar. Then my father's voice, from below me, soft and steady. He said, "Son, are you awake?" I climbed down the ladder. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his union suit and his boots, his father's shotgun broken open across his knees, 2 shells in his shirt pocket. The kerosene lamp was lit. He was looking at the cellar door without looking at it, the way you look at a snake you don't want to acknowledge you've seen. The taps came again. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. He said, "Go back to bed." I said, "Dad, what is that?" He said, "Go back to bed and don't come down again until daylight." I went back up to the loft because I was 34 years old, and my father had told me to, in a voice that I had not heard him use since I was small. I lay there with my eyes open and listened to the taps continue, every couple of minutes, until the gray came up in the windows and the birds started outside. Then the taps stopped. I came down. My father was still at the table, the shotgun still across his knees. He hadn't slept. He didn't look at me. He just said, "We're leaving today. Pack what we've already sorted. The rest can burn." I made coffee. He drank his slowly, both hands wrapped around the mug like he was cold, even though the wood stove had warmed the kitchen well past comfortable. I asked him, "Dad, what's down there?" He just shook his head. I should have done what he asked. I want you to understand that I know I should have, but there is a kind of curiosity that runs in our family, and it has run in our family for a long time. And I think now that maybe my grandfather had it too, and his father before him, and that this is part of how we keep getting drawn back to that cellar across the generations. I waited until my father went out to the truck for the cooler. I lifted the wooden bar off the brackets. I opened the cellar door. The stairs went down too far. I want to be careful when I say this because I know how it sounds. I'm not talking about a feeling. I'm talking about geometry. The cabin's footprint was maybe 18 feet by 24 feet. The kitchen was on the back half. The cellar should have been, at most, a 6-foot drop into a small space dug under that part of the house. What I was looking at was a stone staircase that went down and kept going down and disappeared into a darkness that swallowed my flashlight beam at a depth that was not possible. I counted 32 steps before I lost count. The walls were dressed stone, fitted without mortar, the kind of work nobody has done in this country for 150 years. Cold air came up out of it that smelled like a creek bed in February. I went down. I keep trying to remember what I was thinking and I can't. I think I wasn't thinking. I think there's a state below thinking that takes over sometimes when you're standing on the edge of something you know you're not supposed to look at, and you look anyway because some part of you has already decided. At the bottom of the stairs was a small room, stone floor, stone walls, a single ladder-back chair in the middle, the wood so old it was almost black. On the chair was a folded bundle of clothing, a child's dress, the cotton gone yellow with age, the lace at the collar gone the color of weak tea. The dress was folded carefully, the sleeves crossed over the front the way you might fold a uniform. On top of the dress was a small, flat object. I picked it up. It was a daguerreotype in a hinged case. The case opened easily, the velvet inside still soft. Inside was a portrait of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, in a dress identical to the one folded on the chair. She had a serious face, the way children always did in those old pictures because of the long exposures. Dark hair pulled back, a small mouth, and eyes that I knew. I knew them so well. They were my mother's eyes. The exact shape and set of them, the exact slight downturn at the outer corners. Looking at that little girl was like looking at a photograph of my mother as a child, except my mother was not born until 1958, and this picture had been made by a process that nobody had used since the 1860s. I turned it over. There was writing on the back of the case in pencil, in handwriting I recognized as my grandfather's from the Christmas letters, but firmer than the late ones, from before the tremor started. It said, "She came back in 1962. She comes back every 30 years. I'm sorry." I stood in that stone room and I read those words 6 or 7 times and I could not make them mean anything. And then, slowly, like cold water finding its way down a window, they started to mean something, and I wanted very badly for them not to. I climbed the stairs. I shut the cellar door. I lifted the bar back into the brackets. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the bar twice before it settled. My father was in the kitchen. He'd come back in from the truck. He saw my face, and he saw the dust on my knees, and he sat down at the table and put his face in his hands and started crying. I had not seen my father cry at his own father's funeral. I had not seen my father cry when my mother died. I had not seen my father cry ever in my whole life. He cried like a man who'd been holding it in since he was a boy. He said her name, Annabelle. He said, "That was my sister. She was 6. She went out to play in the snow on a Saturday in February of 1962 and she didn't come back. They searched for 2 weeks. They never found her. My father, your grandfather, was never the same. My mother was never the same. Nobody talked about her after the first year. We had pictures of her in the house when I was small, and one day they were just gone. All of them. Every picture. I asked my father once where they went and he hit me. He never hit me before that and he never hit me again. He looked up at me. His eyes were red and there was something in them I had never seen. He said, "What year is it?" I told him. He counted on his fingers. He didn't have to. He just needed to do it with his hands. 1,962. 1,992. And now, 30 years. 30 years. We left the cabin within the hour. We didn't burn anything. We didn't take anything else. My father drove the whole way back without speaking. When we got to my house, he didn't come in. He sat in the driveway for a long time with his hands on the steering wheel, and then he drove home. He died 11 months later. Heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful, the doctor said. The cabin is still up there. Nobody in our family has been back. I have a daughter now. She's 4. She has my mother's eyes, the ones I saw in the daguerreotype. Sometimes at night she tells me about the little girl who comes to sit on the end of her bed and asks her if she wants to come see the house. She says the little girl is sad. She says the little girl is tired of waiting. I have not told my wife. I don't know what I would tell her. I keep doing the math in my head. 30 years from 1,992 was a few years ago now. So she's already been. She came back, and somebody in this family met her, and I don't know who, and I don't know what happened, and I'm afraid to ask. I'm afraid she came for me, and I just don't remember. I've been doing trail maintenance for the Forest Service as a volunteer for almost 12 years. It started as something to do after my divorce, a way to be alone in the woods without having to explain to anyone why I needed to be alone. And it became something else, over time, something closer to a calling. I know the drainages and ridgelines of the Pisgah and the Nantahala, the way some men know the streets of the city they grew up in. I have a relationship with those mountains that is quieter and steadier than most relationships I've had with people. I tell you this so you'll understand that what I'm about to describe didn't happen to a tourist. It happened to somebody who knew where he was. Last October, the district ranger, a man named Cope who I'd worked with for years, called me up and asked if I could go flag a downed tree cluster about 4 miles off the Mountains to Sea Trail above Linville Gorge. Storm system had come through in September and dropped probably 40 trees across an old spur trail that the Forest Service was still arguing about whether to officially decommission or to clear and keep open. My job was to GPS tag the worst of the blowdowns so the trail crew could plan a chainsaw assault in the spring. Easy work. A long day's hike, but easy. Cope walked me through the route on the topo map in his office. He traced the spur with his finger and then he stopped at a little square marked with hash lines and said, "You're going to pass an old hunter's cabin around mile 3.5. Don't go inside it. Not even on the porch. It's been condemned since the 80s. Roof's a death trap, floor's worse. We've been meaning to get a demolition crew in there for 10 years and we keep not doing it." I said sure, no problem. I'd seen plenty of old cabins on Forest Service land. There are hundreds of them scattered through the Appalachians. Leftovers from before the parks took the land. Some of them from homestead claims that the families never gave up on emotionally, even after they'd given up on them legally. Most are pretty places. In the sad way, ruins are pretty. I figured I'd take a picture and move on. I started the hike at first light on a Tuesday. The October woods were doing what they do in the Blue Ridge that time of year. The maples gone orange and the hickories yellow and the oaks just starting to turn. The air with that clean, cold edge to it, that means winter is making itself known. I made good time on the main trail and turned off onto the spur around 11. The spur was overgrown but passable. I flagged the first cluster of blowdowns around 12:30, ate a sandwich on a log and pushed on. I came on the cabin around 2 in the afternoon. It sat in a small clearing about 30 yards off the spur, in a notch where two ridges met, one room, maybe 12 by 16. Hand-cut log construction, dovetailed corners, the chinking long gone. Tin roof, rusted but intact. A stone chimney on the south wall. The kind of place a man might have built in 1920 to use as a base for fall hunts, and that nobody had hunted out of in 50 years. I was about to take my picture and keep walking when I noticed the windows. There were 3 of them, one on each of the sidewalls and one beside the door. All 3 were boarded shut, with rough-cut planks nailed across them in an X pattern. That wasn't unusual. People board up cabin windows all the time, to keep weather out, to keep animals out, to keep kids and vandals from breaking the glass. But these windows had been boarded from the inside. I stood there for probably a full minute looking at that. You board windows from the outside if you want to protect what's inside from the world. You board them from the inside if you want to protect yourself from something out there. Or, and this was the thought that came to me slow, the way a cold draft finds you in a warm room if you want to keep something in. I should have turned around. I want to make sure I say that clearly. Cope had told me not to go in. The condition of the windows was its own warning, plain as a sign nailed to the door. I had no business approaching that cabin. But there's a thing that happens to me when I'm alone in the woods, and I think it happens to a lot of people who spend time alone in the woods, where my judgment gets a little soft around the edges. The mountains feel safer than they are. You forget to be afraid of the things you should be afraid of. I walked up to the cabin. The padlock on the door was a heavy old brass one, the kind that takes a skeleton key. It had been pried off, the hasp twisted nearly in half, and then somebody had hung the broken pieces back on the door, so that from a distance, it looked like the place was still locked up. The work hadn't been done with any particular skill. It had been done in a hurry. I pushed the door. The smell hit me first, before my eyes had adjusted to the dim. It was a thick smell, 2 layers to it. Copper, the way old blood smells when it's dried and gone dark. And under that, the rotten fabric smell of cloth left out in damp weather for a long time. The smell of a den. My eyes adjusted. The floor of the cabin was covered in deer skulls. I want to describe this precisely because I have thought about it almost every day since. There were dozens of them, maybe 60, maybe 80. They were not piled. They had been arranged. They were laid out in a spiral, starting at the door where I was standing and curling inward toward the back wall, a flat spiral on the floor, each skull placed with care so that the antlers, those that still had them, interlocked just slightly with the next. The spiral was perfect, the kind of perfect that takes hours of work and a particular state of mind to achieve. It was old work and new work both. Some of the skulls were sun-bleached white and crumbling. Some were fresh, still the color of bone that had only recently lost its meat. The spiral led to the back wall, and on the back wall were the photographs. I walked toward them. I had to step carefully between the skulls, and I tried not to disturb any of them, the way you'd tread carefully through a graveyard. The boards under my feet were dry and didn't creak as much as I expected. Somebody had been keeping that floor swept. The photographs were nailed directly into the chestnut logs of the back wall. Color photos, modern. Some printed from digital files on home printer paper, some clearly clipped from missing persons flyers, some that looked like they'd been taken with a phone and printed at a drugstore. Every one of them was a person. Mostly men, a few women. Hikers, by their clothing. Day packs, trekking poles, broad-brimmed hats. Some of the photos were smiling, posed shots, the kind people use for trail registers, or for the picture they send to their family before a long trip. Some were candid, the subjects unaware they were being photographed. I recognized two of the faces. I had walked past their flyers that very morning at the trailhead kiosk. A man named David from Tennessee, who'd gone missing in this section of the forest in August. A woman named Caroline from Asheville, who disappeared in early October. Their faces were on that wall. Caroline's photo had been taped over an older one that was peeking out behind it. Under each photograph, a date had been written directly on the wood in something brown and dry. I looked at one closely, without wanting to. The lettering was careful, almost neat. The brown stuff was thick, and it sunk into the grain of the wood. I think you know what it was. The dates went back years. The earliest one I could read, near the floor on the left, was from 1994. The most recent one, in the upper right of the cluster, was from 4 days earlier. 4 days. I stood there with my hands still hovering near that wall, and the math caught up to me. Whoever was nailing pictures to this wall had done it within the past week. Not in the 80s. Not before the cabin was condemned. Now. The padlock had been pried off recently. The floor had been swept. The windows had been boarded from the inside, and that was inside work. Work that someone could do without anyone passing on the spur ever knowing. Somebody was using this place. Somebody was using it right now. Behind me, the door creaked. It was a small sound. The kind a door makes when a draft moves through it, or when the building shifts. I would have told myself it was the wind, except there was no wind that day. The woods were that perfect October, still. The kind where you can hear a leaf land on another leaf, 2 ridges over. I turned around. The door was where I had left it, about half open, the autumn light coming in across the threshold. Nothing else. Nobody. But on the floor, in the dust at the entrance, were boot prints that had not been there when I came in. They came in from the doorway. They were larger than mine. I'm a size 11, and these were 13, 14, the tread deep and patterned like a heavy-duty work boot. They came in 3 steps and stopped. They stopped right behind where I had been standing when I was looking at the wall. The toes of the prints pointed at the back of where my body had just been. The space between the last print and where my own boots had stood was maybe 2 feet. Somebody had walked into the cabin behind me, walked right up behind me, stood there for some length of time, and walked back out. And I had not heard a single thing. I have hunted in those woods. I have walked silently when I needed to. I know what it takes to move that quietly across a wood floor in dry leather boots, and it is not a thing that an ordinary man can do. It takes patience. It takes practice. It takes a kind of woodcraft that nobody learns by accident. I left that cabin. I won't pretend I left calmly. I went out the door fast, and I did not look back, and I made the 4 miles to my truck in something close to a run, getting tangled in laurel and falling once hard enough to bruise my hip and not stopping. I drove to the ranger station with hands that were not quite working right. I told Cope everything. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which is not how Cope usually listens. When I was done, he said, "All right, I'll call the sheriff." He told me to go home and to write down everything I remembered while it was still fresh. The sheriff's deputies and a Forest Service team hiked in the next morning. I was not with them. I asked Cope later what they found. He was quiet for a while before he answered. He said, "The cabin was empty." I said, "What do you mean empty?" He said, "The spiral of skulls was there. The boarded windows were there, but the photographs were gone. The wall was bare. The dates that you said were written under them, the boot prints in the dust by the door, all of it, gone. Somebody had been in that cabin between the time you left and the time we got there, and they had taken everything off the wall and they had swept the floor. The padlock was gone too. They cleaned up. I asked him if the deer skull spiral had been disturbed. He said no. The spiral had been left exactly the way I'd described it. Whoever had cleaned that cabin had stepped between every skull, just like I had, and not moved one of them. Cope's department put out a request to the FBI. They never found anything. The cabin is still standing. They put a real lock on it this time, and a sign, and they've been promising for 2 years that the demolition crew is coming. The two hikers whose photos I saw, David and Caroline, have never been found. 3 more have gone missing in that section of forest since. I do not go up there anymore. I asked to be reassigned to the Nantahala district last spring and they let me. But sometimes at night I think about that cabin, and I think about the spiral of skulls, and I think about the boot prints stopping 2 feet behind me. And the thing that I cannot stop turning over in my head, the thing that has cost me more sleep than anything else in my life, is this. Whoever was in that cabin with me had every chance. He could have done whatever he wanted. He stood there in the quiet, behind me, while I read his wall and looked at the faces of the people he had taken. And he didn't. I have spent a lot of time wondering why he let me leave. I have spent a lot of time wondering whether he is still out there, and whether he remembers my face, and whether, somewhere on a wall I will never see, there is a date with my name underneath it, waiting for the brown ink to be applied.